Hello and welcome to Byju's Exam Prep. Welcome to our daily Hindu analysis. But before we begin, we have a couple of announcements. This Sunday, that is on the 31st of July, we shall be conducting the BYJU'S National Scholarship Test, and it would be a great opportunity for IAS aspirants to test their current affairs preparedness and also to win attractive scholarships to our IAS courses. So without fail, register for the scholarship test by using the link provided in the description box below. Then tomorrow, as part of our weekly Explained series, Sham sir will be taking up an important discussion regarding India's twin deficit problem. So do tune into our YouTube channel sharp at 8 p.m. on Friday to catch the Explained session live. So with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. This article deals with the topic of money laundering and the Prevention of Money Laundering Act and few important observations that the Supreme Court has made with regard to the provisions of the PMLA. In this case related to money laundering and the provisions of Prevention of Money Laundering Act, the Supreme Court has made few observations yesterday and has upheld the powers of ED or Enforcement Directorate, which is responsible for enforcing this law. But before we go into the article, let's use this opportunity to understand all the important points about money laundering, the threat posed by it, and also discuss the provisions of Prevention of Money Laundering Act in complete detail. See, money laundering is essentially a criminal offense through which illegal wealth is converted into legal wealth. Essentially, black money is cleaned or laundered in order to turn it into clean money or into legal wealth. So this process of transforming illegally gained wealth into legal wealth and assets is referred to as money laundering. See, illegal wealth or black money can be generated through various sources. It can be generated through criminal activities such as organized crime, including drug trafficking, arms trafficking, etc. It can also be generated through corruption, that is, when government officials and ministers take bribes, which essentially amounts to illegally acquired wealth. It is also generated when high net worth individuals or even large private companies, when they evade taxes and underreport their income and profits to the government in order to avoid paying taxes on them. So all such wealth generated through illegal sources becomes black money or illegal assets. But the owners of this black money, they won't be able to freely use their wealth and spend the money as they want, as any large transaction of suspicious wealth will lead to red flags being raised in the banking and financial system that leads the authorities to investigate the sources of such wealth, thus making it risky for the owners of black money to freely spend and use the money in the financial system. So in order to avoid any such suspicion or being scrutinized by the investigating authorities, this black money has to be cleaned of its dirt, which is nothing but the source of this illegal wealth, that is how this illegal wealth was generated, and the owner who owns this black money. So this is where the process of money laundering is employed to remove this dirt of black money, that is to create maximum distance between the source and the owner and the actual money, so that eventually this wealth becomes as good as legal wealth. This is done through the complicated process of money laundering, where the owners of black money employ money laundering agents for a commission to help them convert their black money into legal wealth. In this process of money laundering, there are three basic steps, which includes placement, layering, and integration. Under the first step, the money laundering agents collect the dirty money and they place it into the financial system by avoiding suspicion. There are many different methods of placing the money back into the financial system, and one of the preferred methods is to break up the large sum of money into small amounts and to introduce the small amounts into the financial system through a method known as smurfing. Or they could also make use of hawala networks to move the money around informally and then introduce the money back into the financial system, probably in a different country. They could also physically smuggle the money out of the country to foreign jurisdictions where there is very low scrutiny and then introduce the money into the financial system. Or one could also make use of cryptocurrencies and exploit the anonymity they offer to move the money around and then introduce it into the financial system. Once black money is placed into the financial system through these various illegal routes, then the money laundering agents take up the second step, which is layering. Under the layering step, a series of complicated financial transactions are carried out around the world across several banks and across several countries in order to create maximum distance between the money and the source and the owner. Once this complex step of layering is complete, the money is laundered, and now this black money would have become legal wealth. Meaning, even if authorities were to investigate and try to trace back the origin of this money, it would be almost impossible for them to find out the source and the owners behind it. So the money that has been laundered will now be integrated back into the financial system in order to ensure that these assets and wealth is handed over back to the actual owners, thus completing the third and last step of money laundering. The laundered money is now used to purchase real estate or luxury assets, or it is brought back to the country as foreign investments through the route of foreign direct investments or through FII investments into the capital market. In this entire process of moving money around the world, low tax jurisdictions or zero tax jurisdictions, known as tax havens, are often used by money laundering agents. And they even make use of shell companies or shell corporations, which are set up as front organizations in order to help carry out these fraudulent transactions. As the illegal wealth would have completed one entire round or one entire circle, this process is also often referred to as round tripping. So, this act of money laundering is a criminal act, not just because it threatens our economic security and stability, but it is also a major national security threat. Without a doubt, money laundering destabilizes the economic system as it defrauds the banking and financial system. It could have an impact on the macroeconomic fundamentals of the economy and could also affect the exchange rates and exports and imports, thus posing a serious risk to the country's economic security. Upon that, it also breeds corruption within the government because it is enabling the conversion of black money generated through collection of bribes into clean legal wealth, which is later enjoyed by officials and politicians. And also, in the entire process, there could be several corrupt bank officials and even government officials and private firms who would be involved in the process, thereby leading to promotion of corruption in the system. But apart from these economic threats, money laundering also poses a major threat to our national security because this offense has very close links with organized crime, such as drug trafficking and arms trafficking, and these two are in turn closely linked with terrorism and insurgency. Quite often, terrorists and insurgents they make use of money laundering channels to finance their activities, and hence money laundering can become a route of terror financing. These extremist groups are often involved with organized crime, such as drugs trafficking and arms trafficking, to generate revenue and also to source drugs and weapons for their activities. So, as money laundering directly enables organized crime and terror financing, it poses a very significant national security risk. And hence, to combat this menace, there needs to be an effective national response through a strong law, with adequate powers being given to dedicated institutions and authorities. And you would also need a global response, as this offense is of a global nature, because in the entire process of money laundering, the illegal wealth is moved around multiple jurisdictions. And hence, to tackle this threat at the global level, there is an intergovernmental body as well, known as FATF or the Financial Action Task Force. The FATF acts as a global policy making body that lays down standards to combat money laundering and terror financing. And these anti money laundering counter terror financing measures recommended by the FATF has to be implemented by countries through their respective national legislations. In the case of India, India has abided by FATF standards by bringing out the PMLA or the Prevention of Money Laundering Act back in 2002. This is the primary legal framework in India to tackle money laundering, and after it came into force in 2005, it has clearly outlined the responsibilities for a dedicated intelligence agency and a dedicated law enforcement agency. So, to tackle money laundering as per FATF standards, India also has established a dedicated intelligence agency called FIU, or Financial Intelligence Unit India, which collects financial intelligence and watches out for suspicious transactions in the banking and financial system. Then, to enforce the law, that is, to investigate these cases, a dedicated enforcement agency has been set up, that is, the ED, or the Enforcement Directorate, and both the institutions have been provided with exclusive and concurrent powers under this Act in order to enable them to combat money laundering. Through this law, India has placed obligations on the banking and financial sector, and banks and finance institutions are mandated to keep thorough records of their customers and all transactions by following the formats and standards as prescribed by the authorities, including the RBI. They have been mandated to thoroughly verify the identity of their customers through a rigorous KYC process, that is, Know Your Customer process. And they're also required to furnish any necessary information to the authorities as and when required. Under this law, the offense of money laundering has been clearly defined and also provides tremendous powers to the authorities, including the rights to freeze, seize, and confiscate the assets by classifying them as proceeds of crime. The primary intention of the Act is not just to prevent and tackle money laundering, but also to confiscate the illegal assets that are derived from or involved in the process of money laundering. Then, to deal with terror financing, adequate provisions have been added to the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act 1967, or UAPA, which is India's primary legal weapon to combat terrorism. So PMLA is specific to combat money laundering, and under Section 3 of the Act, money laundering has been criminalized and has been declared as a criminal activity. The Act also goes on to define as to what constitutes the proceeds of crime, thus including all forms of financial assets and properties, in order to ensure that all the illegal wealth that is derived through money laundering is comprehensively covered under the provisions of the Act. The PMLA empowers the Director of Financial Intelligence Unit India to mandate the record maintenance standards and filing of information standards, to mandate how banking and financial records have to be kept and maintained by the banks and financial institutions, and how the information has to be filed and reported to the authorities. This helps the FIU to keep a check on the back end of the banking and financial system and to watch out for any suspicious transactions, thus helping in generating financial intelligence that could be valuable to combat money laundering and terror financing. The ED, on the other hand, as a law enforcement and investigating agency, has the authority and powers to register and investigate a case related to money laundering, and also to search any property or premises, and to seize and confiscate all assets, and to investigate the case and to arrest the accused, and eventually to prosecute them as well. This Act is considered to be a stringent law as it places the burden of proof on the accused, and under this law, the accused is presumed to be guilty until he or she proves their innocence. The burden or responsibility is on the accused to prove that they were not involved in money laundering and to prove that their assets and wealth are not proceeds of money laundering or illegal crime. Then finally, to settle any disputes, an appellate tribunal has also been provided for, and this constitutes India's primary legal framework against money laundering. Over the years, this Act has been amended a few times in order to ensure that India remains in line with FATF standards. And recently in 2019, the FATF was amended by the government to make it an even more stringent law. Through the 2019 amendment, money laundering is treated as a stand-alone crime, thus giving the ED exclusive jurisdiction over money laundering cases, which previously it was sharing with other concerned institutions such as NIA, CBI, and the others. Since money laundering was closely involved with corruption, tax evasion, and terror financing, other institutions would also get involved and they used to take over money laundering cases as well. This was compromising the jurisdiction and the authority of Enforcement Directorate. So now with this amendment, money laundering is being treated as a standalone crime or as an independent crime, which it previously wasn't, and thus helps in giving ED exclusive jurisdiction over money laundering cases. The recent amendment has also expanded the definition and ambit of proceeds of crime to include those properties as well, which may directly or indirectly be derived or obtained as a result of any criminal activity related to the offense of money laundering. Then, more importantly, the amendment deleted the provisions of Section 17, subsection 1 related to search and seizure, and as well as Section 18 related to search of persons, which earlier required the ED to search the accused or any premises and to seize the assets only if an FIR had been registered or a charge sheet had been filed by other concerned agencies, which were looking into related offences such as terrorism, corruption, tax evasion, etc. So in many ways, ED's powers had been curbed and was made dependent on other institutions and other related cases. So with the deletion of these provisions, ED can go ahead and search property, search people and seize their assets without having to wait for an FIR or charge sheet to be filed by other concerned agencies. Then apart from this, under Section 45, an explanation has been added which clarifies that all money laundering offences will be cognizable and non-bailable, making it all the more difficult and almost impossible to obtain bail once the accused is arrested. It also empowers the ED to arrest the accused without a warrant, and even those who indirectly enable money laundering by concealing the proceeds and wealth, and even those who are enabling the accused, even they could be charged with the same criminal offences under the new Act. Then Section 72, which has been introduced through the 2019 amendment, gives powers to the central government to set up an inter-ministerial coordination committee in order to ensure that there is interdepartmental and interagency coordination, as investigating these cases would require the cooperation of multiple institutions and multiple authorities. So essentially, the PMLA has been strengthened through the 2019 amendments, and all these provisions of PMLA were brought under question in a recent case that was ongoing at the Supreme Court. In the case, the strict provisions of PMLA were challenged, but the Supreme Court has clearly upheld these provisions, and thus it has upheld the powers of Enforcement Directorate under the Act. The Supreme Court has remarked that the offence of money laundering is no less heinous than terrorism itself, and the powers enjoyed by ED under various sections, including Section 24, Section 5, etc., have been upheld, and the definition of money laundering has also been upheld by the court. Then the stringent provisions related to bail have also been upheld by the Supreme Court, and the court has stated that these provisions are not arbitrary in nature. The court has stated that it is not mandatory to give an enforcement case information report in every case, and just the statements made by the accused to the ED is sufficient to lead to the arrest of the accused and their eventual prosecution. The Supreme Court has also upheld the powers of ED to attach property and assets in the ongoing case, and a larger bench of the Supreme Court is going to take a look whether future amendments to PMLA has to be introduced through the money bill route. Now let's move to page number 8, where the Hindu carries a series of infographics explaining why the Indian rupee is depreciating rapidly in the last few months. You might be aware that $1 has hit the 79 to 80 rupee mark, thus creating fresh concerns for the Indian economy. So in this context, let's understand what is the rupee exchange rate, and let's also understand the factors responsible for this massive depreciation of the Indian rupee. Let's first understand the foreign exchange market in very simple terms. See, just like you use currency to buy a commodity, similarly, you can use a currency to buy another type of currency. For example, using the Indian rupees, you can purchase the US dollar when you're required to spend in US dollar. Let's say, for example, you're an importer importing oil from a particular country. So obviously, in this case, the oil seller will not directly accept Indian rupees, as the Indian rupee is not fully convertible and the US dollar happens to be the global reserve currency. So the Indian importer will first have to purchase the required amount of US dollars by paying for it in rupees and then use the US dollars to purchase oil. Similarly, when an Indian tourist is going abroad, they have to use Indian rupees to purchase foreign currency which they intend to spend in other countries. The exact opposite happens when foreign tourists visit India. They exchange their dollars or foreign currencies to Indian rupee and use the Indian rupee to purchase the commodities they want in the Indian market. Similarly, if a foreign investor is seeking to invest in India, they will use the foreign currency to purchase Indian rupees and then invest in the Indian market. So, to facilitate these transactions, there exists a foreign exchange currency market called the Forex market, which is very strictly regulated by the RBI. And the inflow of foreign capital that India gets goes into the Forex reserves of India, which in turn is maintained by the RBI. So, in the Forex market, the value of the rupee vis-a-vis the dollar is determined purely by market forces and is not determined by any single institution. So essentially, the demand supply equation determines the exchange rate. The demand for rupees and the demand for dollar in the market determines the exchange rate. And it is always important to maintain a stable exchange rate, which is beneficial to the economy in the long run. Generally, people have a wrong assumption that depreciation of rupee is always bad for the economy and appreciation of rupee is always good for the economy. But this is a very wrong assumption because the value of the rupee has to be inherently found by the market itself, based on the inherent strengths of the Indian economy and the demand supply equation in the economy. Because any sudden or volatile depreciation or appreciation can be both positive and negative for the economy. Because if the rupee depreciates, then importing goods and services will become costlier as the rupee has lost its value and you need to pay more to purchase the dollars needed to import the goods and services. But the same situation will benefit the exporters as Indian exports will become more competitive and cheaper in foreign markets. The exact opposite happens in case of appreciation of our currency. So it's always important to strike the right balance and to maintain a stable exchange rate and to allow the market factors to determine the true value of the Indian currency. But if there is a wild swing or a volatile depreciation or appreciation, it could have an adverse impact on the economy, and hence, every now and then RBI intervenes in the forex market to curb this volatility by either purchasing dollars or introducing dollars through the forex reserves, by parallelly introducing or absorbing the excess rupees in the market. Essentially, RBI once in a while tries to alter the demand supply equation in order to stabilize the exchange rate, as any instability and volatility can have an adverse impact on the macroeconomic foundation of the economy. See, over the decades, the Indian rupee has depreciated vis-a-vis the dollar, and the value has gradually gone down, thus highlighting the weakness in the Indian economy. But the latest crash in the value of rupee to the mark of 79 to 80 rupees per dollar is a trend that is not just limited to India, but happens to be a global trend triggered by a number of global factors. In fact, in the last few weeks, most global currencies have seen a major depreciation against the US dollar because, on one hand, the COVID-19 pandemic, the lockdowns, and then the Russia Ukraine war had destabilized the global economy and the supply chains. So, to trigger growth and to sustain growth over the last 2 years, central banks around the world have pumped liquidity into the markets, including printing of fresh currency. And now, this excess liquidity is leading to high inflation around the world. So, now to curb the high inflation, central banks are pulling back liquidity by raising interest rates. And this has spooked the markets, and as a result, there is a flight of capital around the world. Especially the US has been reporting very high levels of inflation, and the US Fed, or the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the US, has raised interest rates over the last few months. And this automatically leads to a flight of capital from developing economies towards stable economies such as the United States. So this sudden and massive changes that have happened in the demand supply equation has caused volatility in the rupee exchange market and has led the Indian rupee to depreciate against the dollar. So as of 2022, You can see the rupee depreciating against the dollar as a direct result of the Russia-Ukraine war, the COVID-19 crisis, and more importantly, the interest rate hikes that have been carried out by the US Federal Reserve. So if you break down these reasons behind the crisis, one reason is definitely the persistent outflow of capital from India. As mentioned, the US Federal Reserve and central banks of advanced economies, they are tightening their monetary policies to pull out liquidity in order to curb inflation. So as they increase interest rates, developed economies become more attractive for investors, and hence FPIs or foreign portfolio investors, they're pulling out their capital invested in developing economies like India and opting for safer assets and safer places to invest, such as the developed nations. So this sudden and huge flight of capital from India creates a demand-supply mismatch in the forex market, thus contributing to a sudden depreciation of the rupee. In this year alone, FPIs have dumped Indian equities amounting to around $28.4 billion. And along with this, India's trade deficit has ballooned due to increasing imports and rising import bill, whereas exports have more or less remained stagnant. So this happens to be one of the major factors that has led to the depreciation of the rupee. The widening current account deficit and the slowdown in exports that you see in this graph over here has led to an increased purchase of dollars in the forex market, thus weakening the value and demand for the rupee. In this graph, you can clearly see India's rising import bill, which has shot up due to the full reopening of the Indian economy over the last 1 year and also due to rising prices around the world. Prices of essential imports like crude oil, coal, fertilizers, etc. have shot up, thus putting pressure on the import bill and has further widened the current account deficit. But there is still no cause for panic because India has sufficient forex reserves and the RBI is very much capable of defending the rupee if the need really arises. The RBI has already carried out few limited interventions in the forex market by selling dollars and by absorbing excess rupee. But excessive and unnecessary intervention could also cause unnecessary panic in the market. Now let's take a look at this article from page number 4 that deals with the Forest Rights Act. The Forest Rights Act is an important piece of legislation that recognizes the rights of scheduled tribes and other forest dwelling communities. According to the article, the provisions of the Act is being very well enforced in Odisha, and through its successful implementation in the Mayurbhanj district of Odisha, the rights of tribal communities and forest dwelling communities is being upheld. From an examination point of view, the details in the article itself is not directly relevant. But however, this provides us an opportunity to talk about the Forest Rights Act and its key provisions. See, this law, which was enacted in 2006, it recognizes the rights of the forest dwelling tribal communities and other traditional forest dwellers and plays a key role in upholding their individual rights and as well as community rights. Because see, generally, tribal communities, indigenous communities, and other forest dwelling communities, they often have a very harmonious relationship with the forests. They not only reside and dwell in the forests, which would have been their home from several centuries, but they also draw their basic livelihood and their sustenance from the forests. They engage in basic subsistence farming by clearing forest land, and they also collect minor forest produce. And by exploiting such forest resources, they sustain their basic livelihood. And it's not just their economic security and livelihood which is dependent on the forests, but even their culture, their language, and their customs is closely linked with the forests. However, the exploitation of these forest resources by tribal and forest dwelling communities is not over exploitative because they've always practiced sustainable exploitation. As these communities know the importance of forests for their livelihood and well being, they would have imbibed forest conservation and wildlife protection into their culture and customs itself. That is why you often find that in many tribal communities, forests and wildlife are worshipped, and that in itself is an illustration of the sustainable, harmonious living that tribal communities would have established with their forests. But unfortunately, this harmonious relationship was disrupted with the introduction of several government laws starting right from the colonial times going all the way up to post-independent era, where the British government and post-independent government have introduced several laws and rules to regulate the forests in order to limit human activity and to conserve forests and wildlife. The British era laws were largely designed to protect British commercial interests with regard to forest resources and their exploitation. But post independence, the government laws have focused on conservation and environment protection. But these laws have been intrusive into the lives and structure of tribal communities, and quite often they have uprooted them from their native homeland. For example, post independence, forest conservation laws did not recognize the basic rights of tribal communities to dwell within forests. Their basic rights, including agricultural rights and the rights to collect forest produce, were also not recognized legally. And when the government moved to establish protected areas, such as tiger reserves, national parks, biosphere reserves, and wildlife sanctuaries, many of these communities would often be evicted, thus threatening their livelihood and also disrupting their harmonious equation with nature. Hence, to bring about a transformative approach in India's forest management policies, the Forest Rights Act was enacted by the then UPA government to recognize these basic rights of tribal communities and forest dwelling communities. There are four important rights that are recognized under the Act, and this includes title rights, under which the forest dwelling scheduled tribes and other traditional forest dwellers have been given with the right to ownership of forest land with regard to farming, and individual forest dwelling families are allowed to cultivate up to 4 hectares of land, with title ownership also being transferred to them. They're also recognized with usage rights, which allows forest dwelling communities to extract minor forest produce such as honey, gum, resin, rubber, tendu leaves or tobacco leaves, etc. Such minor forest produce can be collected by tribal communities and they can sell them in local markets, which helps them to sustain a basic livelihood. They can even take their cattle for grazing inside designated forest areas as per the provisions of the Act. The Act also recognizes the rights of tribal communities with regard to relief, rehabilitation, and development rights. If a tribal community or a forest dwelling community has been evicted from forest land, then they will enjoy a right to be rehabilitated by the government and to be provided basic relief along with guaranteed developmental rights in order to assure them basic amenities and sustenance of their livelihood in order to compensate for the damages they suffer during any such forced displacement. Then finally, the law also recognizes community rights, such as forest management rights of the forest dwelling community. And even this community right is as important as the other three individual rights that have been recognized by the law. Under this, the forest dwelling tribes can come together as a community to protect and promote their forests and to play an important role in forest conservation and biodiversity protection. Now let's come back to page number 1 and take a look at this important article that deals with replacement level fertility and total fertility rate. These are two very important concepts that you need to understand, which is very relevant for both prelims and mains. Total fertility rate is nothing but the average number of children who would be born to any woman in her lifetime. So on an average, if women in a particular area have 3 children, then the TFR of that region would be 3. Under the concept of total fertility rate, there is an ideal fertility rate known as replacement level fertility, which stands at 2.1, which is required to be achieved in order to establish population stabilization. That is, it essentially means that if a couple have more than 2 children, let's say they're having 3 children on average, then such a high total fertility rate will increase the population of the region for the coming years and decades. But if the total fertility rate is under 2, then the population of the region will start declining and could even reach dangerously low levels in the future. But if fertility rate is maintained at the ideal replacement level fertility, which is 2.1, then the population will automatically start stabilizing itself, because then every couple would be providing for 2 children who would replace themselves, thus eventually leading to zero population growth if this level of replacement level fertility is sustained over a long period. So in order to achieve the total fertility rate of 2.1, which is nothing but replacement level fertility, the government has implemented various population planning measures, including family planning measures, and thus a number of states in India have already achieved replacement level fertility. And in some states, the fertility rate has already gone down below 2.1, as you can see in this table over here. According to the latest National Family Health Survey, which was the fifth edition that was conducted between 2019 and 2021, most of the large states in India, like West Bengal, Punjab, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Maharashtra, Kerala, etc., they all report fertility rates that are lower than replacement level fertility, whereas only few large states like UP and Bihar had higher fertility rates, which was higher than the replacement level fertility. But over the years, with better planning measures, the government has achieved replacement level fertility. And yesterday, the Union Minister of State for Health and Family Welfare has stated that 31 states and union territories have reached a total fertility rate of 2.1 or lesser than that, thereby helping India achieve its target of replacement level fertility. Now, let's take a look at a couple of mains practice questions. The first question: money laundering is not just a threat to the economic security of the nation, but also to its national security. Examine these threats and how India is trying to counter the threat. The second question: Indian rupee has been depreciating under the pressure of global and domestic factors. Evaluate the reasons and how it affects India's exports and imports. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link has been given in the description box below. So before we bring this discussion to an end, if you like the initiative, do support us by pressing the like button, share your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.